Head 1,600 miles north of the upper middle of America. Head straight north so far that you might fear slipping over the North Pole, but just before you do, turn east and from there go another 4,000 miles. You are within the Arctic Circle in Norway in the Lofoten Islands. Ole Edvard Rolvåg, we know him as Ole Rolvåg, author of the epic South Dakota novel Giants in the Earth, was Norwegian from the Lofotens. From an earlier book, his Boat of Longing is a description of his Arctic lands. The place lay on the sea, as far out as the coast dared push itself and extremely far north, so far in fact that it penetrated the termless solitudes where utmost light and utmost dark hold tryst. In summer, an idle sea stretched broad-bosomed and dreaming between skylines for days at a time, too indolent to stir more than just enough to betray its eternal restlessness. Across its glittering reaches, wavelets, in Sabbath mood, billowed lazily. Finding an islet or skerry, they would rise, curious. Then they would murmur on along headlands and around venturesome points, but purl more softly against the beaches of coves. The sea tang and the long-stemmed kelp, peeping up from the soundless deep, would curtsy graciously to the moving softness overhead. Summer night, glorious and big, listened intent. Within the Lofotens, mountains, cast like single strands of pearls, stand like sentinels at this very edge of the earth, stoic, wounded. They are achingly beautiful. So far north, they seem to bear the creation of the earth itself. And just beyond the mountains, truly you can see Asgard, the world of the ancient Norse gods Odin, Thor, and Loki, and within the mountains, Jotunheim, the world of the evil ones, giants and trolls. Think not? Go to the program on South Dakota Public Broadcasting and see for yourself. See if you can explain these upside-down clouds feasting on these mountains. Of the outcroppings of island, stone, mountain, and earth is an island called Engaloya, or Angel Island. To drive to the island, you must submerge yourself under a twisting mountain tunnel for 5 miles. To get to the island, you must drive across what feels to be a high-wire one-car bridge, then an intermediary island, then another one-lane bridge. Though beautifully designed and thoroughly modern, you cannot suppress wondering if you may tip into the fjord. On the island is a hamlet by the name of Stigen, and in that smallest of towns is a church, the Stigen Kirk. My grandfather, Thomas Stigen, was born there. Was the town named after him? No, in fact, from the mountain, a sheer face of rock towering straight up above. He would likely have been Thomas of Stigen. His relatives are buried there. Stigen tombstones rest next to Stigen tombstones, here, there, and then another and another, like tombstones and mountains everywhere, penetrated by sun, wind, rain, and snow. Slowly, they melt into the landscape. Undisturbed Viking burials rest towards the mountain. My grandfather had come to America in 1905 and owned a hardware store in Ortley, South Dakota, as you'd expect, right along the Milwaukee Road Railroad. When you stand in the small town of Stigen and stand in the small town of Ortley, it is impossible not to compare the vastness of the skies, impossible to wonder if you, poof, might not just disappear. Of my grandfather from Stigen, I can remember only his suspenders, his long-sleeved shirts, the cigar butts cast on the driveway, that he would give me shiny nickels, that he'd hold a fishing line at Enemy Swim Lake by Webster, South Dakota, with only his forefinger, and that instead of saying jacket, he'd say yacket. As boys, my 2 brothers and I made fun of him for that. All 3 of his children, my mother and her brother and her sister, graduated from Augustana College, setting a standard of college for generations to come. My grandfather was a Lofo man, a man from the Lofotens. So too was Ole Rovog, and so too was Johan Boyer, author of The Last of the Vikings, now out of print, but available in the library at Augustana University. If you were a Lofo man, you were likely a subsistence farmer in the summer. What you grew or raised, you and your family ate, and in the winter you'd sail a 27-foot Lofoten sailboat into one of the richest spawning waters in the world and pray the cod would make you rich. You'd be paid in cash, the money sewn to an inside pocket of your overalls, drowned in these Arctic waters, and the money goes with you. There's nothing your family back home wants more from you than a Lofoten letter. You are still alive. The envelope sealed in wax, money inside. Ah, now we can eat. At the summer solstice in the Lofotens, 24 hours of sunlight. At the winter solstice, the sun never appears above the horizon. During the winter, all winter long, 3, 5, maybe 10 degrees above the horizon. Once again, Ole Rovog, Boat of Longing, who himself had fished in the Lofotens for 6 winters. But when winter came, there where aforetime bright joy had reigned so strongly, gloom and a numbing fear set in. Then the sea ran terrifically. Storms might rage for a month at a time, aye, and more, the wave roar never abating. Darkness hung like a pall over house and home. It was as though every evil genie had come abroad, hideous to hear in the dead of night the hollow sobbings of the great breakers, the tempest piling the frothy water mountains high and hurling them thunderous upon land would bring men to cower in terror, for that sounded like the crack of doom. Talk was little among people then. They only listened. No one writes better about sailing than Johan Boyer, author of The Last of the Vikings. Christmas came with snow and wind, and as soon as it was over, the great, heavy Lofoten boats were dragged out of the boathouses. There they lay full length upon the beach, not rigged as yet, but the men were very busy getting them loaded, and shouted and made signs with their hands to one another when they had anything to say, as if they were already at sea. By the boathouse below Myron lay the seal. long and heavy. The strangest things were being loaded in her. There were nets in barrels, food in barrels, home-brewed ale in barrels, a barrel of sour whey to mix with soup and to drink mixed with water, a barrel of oil for the lamp in the hut, chests, boxes, and skin rugs. Most of it disappeared into the large space midships, where there was room for much more. The boat looked like some good-natured animal as she lay there, letting people clamber about and do what they liked with her. Now and then, the men would stop, and the bottle would be passed around. So they sailed away. The familiar shore on which their cottages stood disappeared, and in the fresh land wind the boats cut easily through the choppy sea that foamed about their bows. Far up the fjord could be seen other square sails and topsails coming out from the inland districts, and outside new Lofoten boats emerged from bays and inlets and turned out toward the open sea. They were setting out on the familiar voyage northward, those hundreds of miles in wind and cold and blinding snow, the same voyage that their forefathers had made through long past ages. Day after day they sailed on, close-hauled in fair wind or in headwind when they had to tack or simply find shelter behind a headland and wait. They went through sounds and over open sea, and one day it snowed and another it would be clear. It was always cold. And the first thing that Lars and Arndt learned was to stand still hour after hour in the limited space in the boat and feel frozen. The snow wind beat in their faces and the salt spray dashed upon their backs. Their feet grew stiff and cold even when they beat them together every now and then. But in a steady wind there was nothing to do but find their sea legs and put up with the cold. It seemed to Lars that all the men on board began to resemble one another. They stood still and saw the same things and thought about the same things, and their faces were simply a reflection of wind and weather, sky and sea. They grew more like one another every day. No one spoke a word. No one thought any longer. It was only arms that toiled, legs that were stiffly strained, and backs that ached. They were all transformed into rowing machines. They rowed on. The boat was forced on against the current, past headlands, bays, and rocks against which the waves broke and foamed. It was not snowing snow, but the sky was dark with heavy clouds, between which were gleams of green and yellow, and the same darkness and light were faintly reflected in the sea. Then came a stir in the sky. The clouds began to move and became men, animals, fishermen in boats, old women hastening along with shawls over their heads, children riding upon fish, all of them toward a yellow and green fire. And over the sea there was the same commotion. The sky soon became a world of evil, a realm of live goblins, and on the sea below there was nothing but a boat with some fishermen in it, at which all these yellow and gray faces were glaring. The same faces appeared in the sea and surrounded the boat, and both the sky and the sea became dark with monsters. My name is Thomas, and I am a grandson of Thomas Stigen. My wife, two of our grandchildren, our oldest daughter, and myself traveled to this land of Ole Rovog, Boyer, and Thomas Stigen to place our feet on their land in a journey of wonder, gratitude, and homage. We do so to remind ourselves that without my grandfather's odyssey, without his quest, without his tragedy of leaving this stunning place atop of the world, we would not be. My mother, born a full-blood Norwegian on American soil, would not have met my father, and well, I guess that pretty much puts it into me, my daughter, and her children. It's impossible on such a journey to a source of things, to not think of fate, chance, destiny, and the shouldering of resolve it took for my grandfather to make his way to South Dakota. It is the story of all of us, and of immigrants everywhere. When we checked into our Rohrbur, our cabin by the sea, the proprietor handed me an unexpected, freshly baked loaf of bread. She asked of my grandfather what was his name and where was he from. Well, Thomas Stigen of Stigen. She looked at me as if she knew him. It was such a terrible time as she gasped, as if trying to suck her words back in. He had to go. He had no choice. In an 80-year period of time, in the 1800s to the early 20th century, Norway lost one-third of its population to emigration. Years of economic stagnation had taken its toll. Trade policy had changed. All along the seacoast, shipyards that once had been eminent in producing an aristocratic merchant marine powered by sail lost out to foreign countries exploiting the power of steam. Norway adopted the gold standard, strangling its economy of economic oxygen. 100 years before, Norwegian population freed from the plague and other disease had exploded. And in an ag economy, too many people, not enough land. And if you were a farmer and other than the oldest son, Norwegian folktales instruct that kindness, deportment, and empathy, even to trolls and hags, will lead to marrying the king's daughter and receiving half of the kingdom. But the quest is most often taken because the younger sons are forced off the farm to fend for themselves. But most powerfully, American fever ran rampant. The promise of free land and leaving the old country became to the young, leaving the old way of doing things. Rovog, in his Boat of Longing, writes of this too, and I can only imagine my grandfather's story might have been very much the same. In Rovog's book, son Nils is out on the fjord, fishing with his mother Anna. There was unease in the family. Something was happening. There was talk, writes Rovog. Now there is scarcely any situation more effectual for bringing two human souls close to each other than that of sitting together in a boat of a fine day. In such a circumstance, the one mind finds it very easy to unfold to the other. The two come forth to meet, as it were, seeking understanding, finding it, and being made more calm thereby. It was thus with mother and son that morning. Mother Anna maneuvered the boat, Nils pulled in the lines. During the work, both were too occupied for many words to pass between them. But when they sat there in the quiet, rowing toward land, Mother Anna asked point blank, "Are you thinking of leaving us, Nils?" "Of leaving you?" "Aye. Are you going away from us?" "No, not away from you exactly." "But you are going away?" "Well, for a while I am." "Do you intend to hire out?" "No, that'll not do." Mother Anna gave a sigh of relief. Such not being his intention, it couldn't be so bad after all. "Is it a sailing trip, perhaps?" she came back, lighter-voiced. "No, it's not that either." A brief inner struggle. Then baldly, "I'm going to America." "Where, my boy?" Mother Anna held the oars. The blur made it almost impossible for her to distinguish him, though he sat directly opposite her, aft in the boat. "I've decided to go to America," said Nils quietly. His face was blood red. Neither could muster a word. A barrier of leaden inertness filled the space between them. Then Nils manned himself. "You see, it's this, Mother, that I must go." "You must?" "Aye, because life is not in this place." Later, Rovog writes of Nils's dog. "And there on his knees in the heather lay a tempest-tossed old sea-dog, beseeching God to bless the child he loved beyond all measure. He prayed, he bemoaned, he implored, and prayed again that God in his mercy and almighty power would turn the thought of the boy away from his folly. But no heavens opened to Joe by the sea, and no angel descended, no, not just then." North and South Dakota, to a very significant degree, were populated by Norwegians. In 1900, 37% of South Dakota's Minnehaha County's population was Norwegian-born. Rovog writes of his Lofotens settlers in South Dakota. Book 1, The Land Taking, Toward the Sunset. Bright, clear sky over a plain so wide that the rim of the heavens cut down on it around the entire horizon. Bright, clear sky today, tomorrow, and for all time to come. And sun, and still more sun. It set the heavens afire every morning. It grew with the day to quivering golden light, then softened into all the shades of red and purple as evening fell. Pure color everywhere. A gust of wind sweeping across the plain threw into life waves of yellow and blue and green. Now and then a dead black wave would race over the scene, a cloud's gliding shadow, now and then. It was late afternoon. A small caravan was pushing its way through the tall grass. The track that it left behind was like the wake of a boat, except that instead of widening out astern, it closed in again. Johann Boyer, fellow Lofoten writer, the exquisite author of Lofoten Sailing and the Last of the Vikings, writes of his Lofoten family settling in North Dakota in his book, The Immigrants. At last he could turn and look away across his first furrow. Well, that was the first. And something like earth, too, rich, dark soil. He took up a handful and smelled it, and his face softened. Somehow it reminded him of the smell of cream porridge. Ha ha! This was earth, and no mistake. Turning the plow, he began another furrow. As the soil curled over, it gleamed in the morning sunlight. For thousands of years the soil had lain here waiting for him, and now he had come. Dakota wasn't easy, sometimes impossible to fathom. The middle of the North Dakota prairie, winter, cold, snow, blizzards. The nearest settlement, 100 miles away. North Dakota settler and Lofo man Eric had searched for his oxen in a blizzard all day, was himself lost, never found his oxen, and both his feet were frozen. Someone would have to trek 100 miles across the frozen tundra not to get a doctor, but to seek a doctor's advice. Eric's friend Morton did just that, slapping on some long sticks for skis, and for day and night and day in the midst of wolves and blizzards, building a snow hut to survive the night. And here too, Boyer, whether the open prairies or open oceans, the instincts of a sailor. It was rather slow work to make a snow hut with his hands, feet, and ski stick, but at last it was large enough for him to creep inside. He took his gun in with him and drew over his boots a pair of thick snow socks that his mother had knitted for his last trip to the Lofotens. There was nothing like these to keep the frost out. Then he put on a heavy Iceland jersey over his coat, pulled his cap well down over his ears, took a small blanket out of his knapsack, and put the empty knapsack under his head. Not a bad bed, this. He closed his eyes and was soon fast asleep. Next day he plodded on in the cloudy weather, steering southeast by the compass. Not that he trusted the compass altogether, he relied more upon his sailor's instinct, gliding on and on, not too fast, but steadily. Was that the howl of a wolf? Turning around, he saw something following him. Pooh, it was only a coyote. At midday he stopped for a few hasty mouthfuls, then on again. Far back in the snowy wasteland, behind him, lay a comrade, waiting. It began to snow, softly, gently at first. Then the snowflakes fell faster, the wind began to rise, and soon it increased to a blizzard. He could see nothing now but a seething, whirling Armageddon of snow, and often it felt as if the wind lifted him up and hurled him bodily into another land. But still he struggled on. Now and then he turned his back to the storm and peered at his compass. Then bending forward he groped his way on. Whither? Instinct again. He was out sailing in a sea mist. He must take care not to go too far to the left. He could not light a fire tonight, and must be content to munch his bread and pork without anything to drink. Morton made it the 100 miles, consulted with the doctor, found out what had to be done, amputation of course, and turned around back again, 100 miles back across a snowy, washed prairie, to return to the settlement, a mere speck on a trackless land. 100 miles out, 100 miles back. He made it. His friend Eric did not, and was dead by the time he returned. And then what of Ole Rolvog's settlers near Sioux Falls? Well, the title of his book is not Giants of the Earth, but Giants in the Earth. The final chapters? On the border of utter darkness, the power of evil in high places, the glory of the Lord, and the great plain drinks the blood. We had twisted and contorted our car, sufficient for it to make it through the 5-mile tunnel towards Angel Island and the town of Stephen. Less than a mile from being released by the tunnel, the highway took us along a stand of mountains that in their elegance stood soundlessly as if they were hanging from the sky. The fjord was glassy calm, a mere finish reflecting the mountains so perfectly that like maidens standing before a mirror, you could almost feel them blush. Anneliese, my granddaughter, whose name we had found on the stern of a sailboat in Trondheim a few days before, and Brendan, our grandson, made it down the embankment to the waterfront. My daughter and my wife and I stood above, hushed amidst such splendor. Below on the beach, Anneliese and her brother, like children everywhere, threw rocks in the water. The mirrored surface broke in concentric circles. The tiny waves moved both towards us and away from us forever. Indeed, we had come to the Lofotens.